Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. EU President Ursula von der Leyen urges Putin to prolong grain deal. US President Joe Biden authorizes Pentagon to send up to 3,000 reserve forces to Europe and the war in Ukraine. Plus, President Putin says new arms to Ukraine will change nothing on the battlefield. Thank you so much for joining us. President Vladimir Putin says Russia is set to withdraw from a deal allowing the export of Ukrainian grain via the Black Sea unless its own demands are met, reaffirming Moscow's tough stance ahead of the deal's expiration on Monday. President Putin, in comments to Russian state television, also says the United Nations had so far failed to come up with a satisfactory solution to the issue, and he denied having received any letter containing proposals from the UN Secretary-General. A Kremlin spokesman later clarified that Russia has not taken a final decision on whether to exit the grain deal. The United Nations and Turkey brokered the Black Sea Grain Initiative with Russia and Ukraine in July 2022 to help alleviate a global food crisis that worsened after Moscow sent forces into Ukraine and blockaded Ukrainian ports. Meanwhile, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin discussed the Black Sea grain deal with his Turkish counterpart Burak Akapar in a phone call on Wednesday. The Russian Foreign Ministry affirms that the conversation was initiated by Turkey and special attention was paid to the implementation of the Black Sea Initiative on the export of Ukrainian food. Also on Wednesday, he held a phone call with top UN trade officials Rebecca Greenspan. The sides exchanged views on the implementation of the Istanbul Package agreements of July the 22nd, 2022, in the context of global food security challenges. Britain's United Nations Ambassador Barbara Woodward has accused Russia of stonewalling by delaying attempts by top UN officials to speak to Moscow about the Black Sea grain agreement. She added that Britain is doing what it can to keep the grain deal alive and that the ball is in Russia's court. Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky has had a discussion about grain with his South African counterpart Cyril Ramaphosa. This took place just yesterday, and in his nightly address, President Zelensky reported that both he and President Ramaphosa are in agreement on the importance of grain exports through the Black Sea. Now, President Zelensky declared that any Russian attempts to hinder food export, particularly to African regions, shall be seen as terrorizing the whole world with hunger. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has urged the Russian President Vladimir Putin to prolong the deal, allowing the Black Sea export of grain, saying the consequence of not doing so will be global food insecurity. The ball is now in Russia's court, with the whole world watching, according to Ms. von der Leyen at a press conference alongside UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
Secretary General, I want to thank you for your tireless efforts to prolong the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The world needs it. Russia has a responsibility to prolong it. Otherwise, global food insecurity will be the consequence. So now the ball is in President Putin's court, and the world is watching.
A military official has confirmed that American-supplied cluster munitions have been delivered to Ukraine. The Joint Staff Director for Operations, Lieutenant General Douglas Sims, made the statement while addressing a news conference. More than 100 countries, including key U.S. allies, have banned cluster munitions because of their potential threat to civilians. The bombs work by scattering smaller bomblets across a wide area. If any of the bomblets fail to explode, they can pose a long-term risk to anyone who encourages them, similar to landmines. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden has authorized the Pentagon to send up to 3,000 reserve forces to Europe as Russia's war in Ukraine continues. Under the new authorization, the reservists will be part of Operation Atlantic Resolve, the ongoing rotational deployment that bolsters NATO and its eastern flanks. The newly signed executive order designates Operation Atlantic Resolve as a contingency operation, which gives reservists the same benefits as active duty service members. No U.S. troops are directly involved in the war in Ukraine, as Kyiv is not a member of the NATO alliance. The U.S. has more than 100,000 service members in Europe, a number that has grown since Russia's invasion began in February 2022. Now, the move gives the Defense Department another option to send more capabilities to assist U.S. European Command, but a defense official said it'll take likely approximately 6 months to send their reservists to the theater because of the advance notice required. The added troops will likely work in logistics and sustainment or medical fields like dentistry and healthcare, roles that the reserves typically have more of than the active duty force. Since 2014, U.S. forces have deployed to Europe under Atlantic Resolve to work with allies and partners in the region. Russian President Vladimir Putin is boasting that supplies of new weapons to Ukraine will change nothing on the battlefield, but will further escalate the conflict there. President Putin, speaking on state television, also says tanks provided by Western powers to Ukraine will be a priority target for Russian forces fighting. He reiterated his opposition to Ukraine joining NATO, saying this will threaten Russia's own security. Meanwhile, Sweden's top court has blocked the extradition of 2 Turks who Ankara says are part of a terrorist group, potentially complicating Stockholm's bid to join NATO, just days after Turkey dropped objections to Sweden's membership. The court said in a statement that in Turkey's view, the 2 committed a criminal act by joining the Gulen movement via a mobile application used by its members. These actions alone did not equate to participation in a terrorist organization under Swedish law, the court said, adding that extradition must be based on actions that constitute a crime in both Sweden and Turkey. Now let's speak to security consultant, Mr. Oyekachi Adekoya, who's speaking to us online here in Lagos, Southwest Nigeria. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me, and good morning to the viewers.
Beginning from the last story that we just communicated, Turkey has said, okay, the road is free for ratification of Sweden's membership to NATO. But now with not allowing these 2 questionable characters in Turkey's opinion to be extradited, does this in any way really tamper with Turkey's position on ratification of Sweden's membership, which they say it's just a matter of course because, according to them, when the parliament comes back on board, either in Turkey or Hungary, then it's just a matter of course before that happens. So does this in any way dampen their ratification?
Yeah, it's difficult to understand what game Erdogan is playing currently in NATO. I mean, difficult to see. You must understand that it's a complex web of geopolitics going on at the moment. Turkey doesn't have enough incentive to ratify Sweden's membership until it sees the F-16 on its soil. The F-16 has been requesting for. The other side to this is that Turkey and Israel do not enjoy any good relationship, as it were. So Israel watching out Turkey getting F-16 also complicates the relationship between the US and Israel and within that region. For now, Turkey seems to be bent on maximizing its leverage it has currently in NATO. I mean, Turkey will do what is best for Turkey and will play the game as best as it sees it. If you recall, just yesterday or the day before, we saw in the reports that Turkey will allow France to manage a nuclear plant being built by Russia. So it gives me a sense that Erdogan is doing what he sees best for Erdogan and for Turkey. So it's difficult to see and get a clear sense of the game going on, if you ask me.
But they were using this Kurdistan People's Party in Sweden, who are anti-Turk, as Erdogan says, as a sort of sword of Damocles hanging over their ratification of Sweden. Now that these two individuals, who Sweden says they've not committed that much of a crime to demand extradition, are going to remain in Sweden, do you think Turkey will change their mind?
No, like I said, I think Turkey will do what is best for Turkey. And for now, Turkey holding out is what is best for Turkey. So that's what they're going to do. The Swedish constitution allows for some of these things. We've seen just, I think yesterday or the day before again, the burning of the NATO charter in Sweden. We've seen also further appeals or requests for authorization to burn more religious books in Sweden. Even some parts of the Swedish populace also do not want to join NATO. So I expect that you see some of this protest action from the Swedish populations that are not in favor of joining NATO. So what would happen is that it's government to government, not people to people. So the governments at play, brokered and being engineered by the US, would do what is best for their own strategic interests. So I don't see some of this Kurdish elements in Sweden being a major decider. Remember, Erdogan has he has a 5-year term. He's not on the polls, so there's nothing really at stake for him. And you can look at the realignment within the Arab states. So Erdogan does enjoy some stability. He can take some risk. If he calculates that getting his hand on the F-16 is worth more for him, the troubles of just small skirmishes with some of these Kurdish fighters, then why not? So the bottom line is just a wait and see game to see what happens. But I don't see Sweden joining NATO this year. If it will happen maybe early next year or second quarter next year. That would be so a lot of between now and then, you will see a lot of shifts between the parties and the citizens of the parties. So nothing much here.
Interesting. Is it controversial for President Joe Biden of the United States to send 3,000 reservists to Europe amidst this Ukraine war because of the timing and because it's an executive order, thereby bypassing Congress?
Yeah, so we must remember that war is an extension of politics, or politics in another format. Now, if you look at the histories of wars are won and lost on the grounds of diplomacy. The 3,000 additional reserves being moved to Europe, I mean, doesn't bulk up the over 100,000 forces currently stationed in Europe, and poses no threat to the 1.2 million Russian soldiers already mobilized, with about 750,000 almost stationed on a war footing. So it's just, I think, for the optics of it, maybe another talking head and a talking point, but doesn't change necessarily the conditions on ground. For now, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. If Lithuania, for example, or Poland, or any detachment of NATO forces gets into Ukraine, that those forces become a legitimate target, as the Russians have been doing with the Kinzhal missiles and their pinpoint strikes on some of those command centers and facilities assisting the Ukrainians. So it doesn't change anything on the ground, 3,000 to what Russia has mobilized. I think it's more or less for the optics. Same with the cluster munitions, same with the talk of the Leopard tanks, same with the long-range strategic missiles being offered by UK and France. none of this changes the condition on ground. What changes, according to Lavrov, the conditions on ground for them is the presence of the nuclear-capable F-16 fighter in Ukraine, and that they would treat as an escalation, an existential threat to the Russian Federation, which we must concede have exercised some reasonable restraints up till now. So, I mean, like we say, it's a fast-moving environment. The conditions are quite dynamic and fluid. But the 3,000 movement doesn't change anything significantly on the ground. It adds no pressure. It changes nothing. I think it's more or less for the optics.
If that is so, then why do you think he had to bypass Congress? Is it because he expects that they think it will be considered by Russians as a shot across the bow for them to have these reservists come on, even though we know they say that they're there for logistical purposes, they'll be there for dental work and Medicare. But as you say, because of the optics, but the optics, is it dangerous optics?
Yeah, I mean, I worry that even if it goes on the floor, you can. There's a vote that just passed yesterday, I think, in the U.S. House of Representatives. I think you had 364 members of the House vote in favor of continuing the funding of the war in Ukraine. So I don't think that he bypassed that for that reason. Executive orders are what they are. They're a form of legislation, but under executive privilege. So, I mean, within the powers that Joe Biden has provided to him by the U.S. Constitution, he's taking a bypass just to speeding up his posture, or I mean, whatever it is. Don't forget that we have seen reports to suggest that some of the active members of the U.S. forces have had to resign their appointment and take up contractor missionary status in Ukraine. And they are suffering some casualty. And of the 100 and something thousand stationed in Europe, not 100,000 of them are combatants. So if you need to bulk up, replace, or ensure that you have your footing correctly, then you can do that. So there's the optics, there's the politics of it. I don't see that changing anything significantly, and I don't think that he's bypassed Congress just because he would not get the support, because it does look as though there are more people on Capitol Hill that are quite enthused about this idea of a strategic defeat to Russia, anything short of a nuclear escalation, and you can go into history between Russia and the US in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, each party ensuring that, whatever venture the other one is on takes a significant toll on them. So I think that it all goes into that old Cold War mindset. So there's a lot of enthusiasm on the Hill, as it were, to ensure that Russia sees a strategic defeat, but short of a nuclear escalation or Third World III. So neither here nor there. I think Joe Biden just took the shortcut as he sees fit.
The Ukrainians strongly believe that the receipt of these these munitions, these bomblets, the cluster munitions, will aid them in resolving the impasse, which I think that is the message that is being sent across the board, that the Russians are deeply entrenched. Even though the Ukrainians are making advances in certain areas, the Russians say they're doing so as well and repelling the Ukrainian counteroffensive, that these cluster munitions will help to do just that, to get rid of the capabilities of the Russians to stay in those areas at the front lines. This is against what you said, that it could be for the optics of it. But now that it has come to this point, for which reason many countries have said, no, don't send cluster munitions, do you think this at the front line makes it worse for the Ukrainians or makes it worse for the Russians, who have ample time to prepare for this?
Yeah, so you must remember that Ukraine and US are not signatories to the ban on the use of cluster munitions. So that's the first thing. The countries who are spoken of are tacitly in support of anything that inflicts a significant damage on Russia. So they have to, by law, which they have signed on to, make those statements. But that doesn't mean that they do not support it. That's on the one hand. You must remember that also that in the information domain, there's also propaganda war going on. HIMARS was supposed to change the conditions on ground. It did not. The Leopard tanks were supposed to change the conditions on ground. It has not. The Javelin missiles were supposed to change the conditions on ground. We stopped talking about some of these weapon systems because Russia continues to develop significant countermeasures against some of this NATO system. And the argument now, I mean, even from the Ukrainian defense minister that said that Ukraine has become a testing ground for new weapon systems of sorts, you know, even for the Russians. Now, if you look at the line of defense and front line, Russia has built over 3 layers of defense, in some places 4 to 5 layers of defense. They have achieved strategically what we call a defense in depth. It's likened to you building up a big wall and allowing your enemy to just dissipate energy, ramming himself into that wall. Not forgetting that Russia also is the successor in title to the weapons stockpile of the former USSR, with significant capabilities yet to be utilized. Russia also has cluster munitions. It also has more dangerous munitions than the cluster munitions. It still has what it calls the father of all bombs. It has strategic weapons within its arsenal, even chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. Russia would not be Hitler from their own perspective. There's no way they lose this war without going into escalation. So cluster ammunition again, how many would be provided to Ukraine? We do not know. The US does not have so much in its stockpile. Again, it's all optics, if you ask me for my own assessment, because Russia has far more dangerous weapons than Ukraine. The economy is seemingly doing well. Inflation is under 2%. So what I would think is that some of these weapon systems going to Ukraine with long-range capability will seek to destabilize supply lines within Russia and make life a bit more uncomfortable for the Russians, who seem to be doing fairly well despite the over 10,000 or so sanctions slapped against them. So for me, it's just optics, subtle escalation, likened to boiling a frog in water gradually. So there's this small buildup of aggression against Russia, not enough to stoke them into a dangerous escalation, but to sustain this war of attrition to a point where Russia suffers some significant discomfort for their effort. But none of this will lead to a victory on the ground for Ukraine based on what we are seeing so far.
The US President Joe Biden, to paraphrase him, when asked, says he doesn't think the Russians will use nuclear weapons. There's no indication that Russia will ever use nuclear weapons. The tactical nuclear weapons, which have been deployed to Belarus already, and we don't know the extent to which that has occurred, but we do know that it has been moved there. If you listen to President Lukashenko of Belarus, seems to tell a different story. Are you of the view that if push comes to shove and President Putin's back is against the wall, that he will not use these tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus?
Yeah, so I've heard some of these comments before. We must remember that the Russian Federation is an independent state and not under the US in any way. The US cannot determine for Russia when or when not to use nuclear weapons, when itself has used nuclear weapons a couple of times. That's on the one hand. The movement of nuclear weapons, not some technical nukes, but proper nuclear weapons to Belarus just seems to sort out the northern flank of Russia, with Belarus bordering Poland, and giving NATO some food for thought, particularly when you place them on the Iskander missiles and some of the other capabilities that are stationed currently in Belarus. Remembering also that there's the option of pursuing a decapitation of Kiev through Belarus into Kiev. You already have 150,000 Russian soldiers stationed there with Wagner, the Belarusian army forming a joint command with Russia, trying to stage a preemptive posture against any NATO incursion from Poland or Lithuania. So that gives the NATO planners and planners in Ukraine some food for thought. Yeah, so would Russia use a nuclear weapon? It has said it doesn't want to, but if it becomes existential for Russia, yeah, then those weapons are not just there for fancy. Russia has the world's largest, most dangerous nuclear arsenal. As a matter of fact, Russia has artillery systems that can fire tactical nuclear weapons. They have different delivery modes, air, land, sea, based for delivering those weapon systems. They also have the Samad missile, I think that can reach France in just a matter of seconds, reach Germany in seconds, reach the US in about 14 minutes. So Russia has all these capabilities. It depends on what happens on the ground and depends on how they choose to act. So we just hope that the world will walk back from the brink of nuclear war and de-escalate so we don't get in the situation of World War III.
Very concerning, this information you're sharing with us, and very important as well, which we thank you for. Also, we should remember that the nuclear weapons in Belarus some of them have the explosive yield of 300 kilotons, which is in far excess of the 16 kilotons that destroyed Hiroshima. So it's very scary.
Absolutely.
But finally,
absolutely.
Sir,
please.
Yeah, please go on. You wanted to say something?
No, absolutely, please.
Okay, so what is worse, finally, for President Putin? What do you think is worse? Him losing this war by way of being overwhelmed by the weapons deployments and possibly the will of the Ukrainian forces, or him having to concede defeat and having to give up his entire military operation because he was forced to do so by way of negotiation? What do you think will be the Achilles heel for President Putin that will push him to desperation?
I see Putin being quite nuanced and very deliberate about his actions. He's resolved not to dangerously escalate or pursue a decapitation in Ukraine is very well measured. In my own assessment, I don't see Russia losing this war. One, because it's a nuclear power, and in the event that a nuclear attack occurs in Ukraine, I don't see NATO striking back Russia with nuclear weapons because of the doctrine of mutual assured destruction and the risk of a nuclear winter, which will blanket the whole world in a disaster, and that will be the end of humanity. So I think that Ukraine is playing a dangerous game, and I think that the West is also playing a dangerous game with Ukraine. I think that de-escalation should be the way to go. Russia never had the military might to threaten NATO or Europe in the first instance. All it had was its nuclear weapons. At the time they moved into Ukraine, they moved in about 90-something thousand soldiers, which was inadequate to the task. I think what they did was a feint to try and negotiate and bring NATO to the table. Today, Russia has mobilized over 1.2 million soldiers. So we can see the dangerous escalation with the inclusion of Finland and Sweden and Russia moving up its soldiers to about 1.2 million. It's gone now into an industrial mode for the production of the Kinsel missiles. It's now released, I think, the second Sukhoi 35 fighter craft to the Air Force, aerospace forces. Russia is now fully mobilized on a war footing. And you're just going back into the Napoleon era, the war with Hitler. I think Russia has cut its teeth in fighting long distance endurance wars of attrition. And Russia can go on for as long as this war needs, because all the supply lines, the wealth of Ukraine is in eastern Ukraine. Russia already has this in its pocket and has built over 4 or 5 lines of defense with this place. With the economy doing well, with the Shanghai, the Asian, the BRICS parts of the diplomacy looking good for Russia. So Russia can be patient all at once, and hope that the West will exhaust itself. And if it comes to a point of dangerous escalation, I think that Russia is well reserved for that long posture war with NATO. It has prepared for a war with NATO all its life. And I think that we'll make a mistake to underestimate the possibility of a dangerous escalation on the part of Russia and NATO. The world doesn't need that. The amount of money spent in Ukraine is over $76 billion, and that could have been done, put in better use. So those are my thoughts, if you ask me.
Yes, and to rebuild Ukraine now as it stands, we understand it needs over $400 billion to rebuild Ukraine as it stands, and that's increasing by the day.
Absolutely, and that's not counting the lives lost already.
Exactly. So de-escalation, armistice, treaties, that's what we want to hear from around the world. Thank you so much, Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya, security consultant, who joined us from Lagos, Southwest Nigeria. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, military operations, we now show the Pentagon says Wagner not operating in Ukraine in a significant way. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Pentagon in the United States is affirming that the Wagner mercenary group is not participating in military operations in Ukraine in any significant way. The statement is coming more than 2 weeks after the group staged a brief armed mutiny in Russia. Wagner fighters that waged some of the fiercest and bloodiest battles during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but in the wake of the June 23 to the 24th revolt, fighters were given the option of going into exile, joining Russia's regular forces, or going home. It appears America is serious about pursuing a prisoner exchange for a Wall Street Journal reporter who's been detained in Russia for more than 100 days. At least that's what U.S. President Joe Biden says. Earlier this month, the Kremlin suggested it was open to a possible prisoner exchange that could involve Ivan Gershkovich, but it underscored that such talks must be held out of the public eye. Speaking at a news conference in Helsinki, Finland, President Biden made clear that the U.S. is interested. Meanwhile, Mr. Gershkovich's sister described her brother as brave as they marked 100 days of his detention in Russia. During an event to talk about the case held at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., Danielle Gershkovich spoke of her brother's demeanor and commended his bravery, facing charges of allegedly collecting military secrets in the city of Yekaterinburg. The United States insists he was wrongfully detained and is demanding his release. Jason Conte, general counsel at Dow Jones, which publishes the Wall Street Journal, describes the lengthy team of lawyers and advisors aiding Gershkovich through what he described as an opaque legal system. Jason Razian, an opinion writer for the Washington Post who was wrongfully detained in Iran, said he hopes Gershkovich is aware of the fight the Wall Street Journal and U.S. officials are putting up to bring him home.
But yeah, I'd love to do one of my mom started a tradition to do these family vacations, just insisted that anytime you come home, we have a vacation all together. So I'd love to do that. And my dad's going to bring the whole grocery store with him. And he and Evan will cook up an amazing dinner, and I'd love to have a beer with him. But we're just trying to, learn everything that we can, and just try to mostly stay strong, try to keep the spotlight on Evan's case.
Yeah.
There's something you'll see in his eyes as an adult now. It's just this like mischievous glint that he still has from childhood. So he's just, he has a serious side to him. He's really driven and hardworking, and he's always been that way since he was a kid. But yeah, he's, like I said, I was bossy. So I'd say, we're going to do this. And he would just do it with me. So we'd climb trees. We'd put on shows for our parents. He was always down to do whatever I'd come up with. I'm just so proud of him. I don't know how he's staying so brave, but it means I have to stay brave for him too.
So the Russian legal system is a bit opaque, as you would imagine. Everyone was taken, accused of having state secrets, not a lot of additional details. In the Russian system, there's a long investigatory period that can be extended, and it gets extended in periods of 2, 3, or 4 months. So that's what you've seen over the last 100+ days. There have been multiple hearings. There's a hearing to decide whether or not he should be continued to be detained. We ask for him to be released, home arrests, those kinds of things. That gets denied, and we appeal. That gets denied. So at this stage, Evan's detention is set until August 30th, and we will see another hearing at that time, probably another appeal.
Joining us virtually from Enugu is former lecturer on diplomatic and consular relations law, faculty law, Nasarawa State University, KEFI, Barrister Chukwuemeka Eze. Good morning, and thank you for making out the time to join us today.
Good morning, thank you. I'm speaking from Enugu, southeastern Nigeria.
Indeed. Mr. Eze, let me start with a ballpark question. Historically speaking, countries that fight wars emerge economically stronger, militarily stronger, in many cases, this side of the Northern Hemisphere. In the case of Ukraine, does Ukraine emerge stronger after this conflict?
It is doubtful. But you recall that George Bernard Shaw said that the lesson from history is that we don't learn from history. And I think George Santayana said that those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. If we get back to history, you recall that after the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 and the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, followed by the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. Those twin events brought sufficient chaos to Ukraine, and it was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of 3rd March 1918 that Ukraine became independent. But Ukraine continued to be a country of anarchy up to 1919 and 1920, with struggling to have Ukraine, Russia having part of Ukraine, and Germany, including Czechoslovakia, part of Ukraine. So why have I gone into this? Is to talk about whether Ukraine stronger. Ukraine became stronger after the initial chaos at the beginning of its independence. And over the years, Ukraine has been rising. If Ukraine survives war, I believe Ukraine will be strong. The history of where Ukraine is coming from.
Okay, thank you for that history lesson. Now, President Joe Biden says that Ukraine has lost the war. What are your thoughts?
I have always believed that without Western or NATO support, that Ukraine cannot win this war. Because Ukraine doesn't have that revolving power. That is to say, have another set of soldiers to replace it. And continue to have soldiers to replace, unlike Russia with its population. Russia will continue to have that revolving power of replacement of soldiers even in 10 years. I doubt that Ukraine, when it continues in this war of attrition and it lasts up to 10 years, whether Ukraine will have the soldiers to continue to fight the war. And remember that Ukraine does not have the area power to fight this war. It depends on the supply of NATO members, and those supplies have not come. So to what extent Ukraine can sustain its push without area power, without the Air Force, the requisite missiles, although it has been promised of cluster munitions, but I doubt whether it will be sufficient to hold its ground to recover the territories, the Donbass, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Crimea, and other areas, even parts of Kherson, that are in the hands of Russia. So I tend to agree with Biden that Ukraine, unless there is consistent support from NATO, but it may have stalemate. If Ukraine can find the war to a point of stalemate for negotiations, I think it would have more than done the war. But as to defeat Russia, I doubt whether Ukraine will win.
We do apologize for our viewers. There was an audio glitch. We couldn't hear. There was a distortion in part of the tail end of what you were saying. But Barrister Eze, in the midst of this information overload, as the developing stories continue coming out of Russia and Ukraine, many have lost sight of the leaked Pentagon documents that stated that there are special forces from many countries, a number of countries, I shall say, including the United States, in Ukraine, assisting Ukraine, bypassing all military conventions. Now with these 3,000 reserve soldiers sent to Ukraine, authorized by President Biden of the United States via executive order, should we have any concerns?
This is war, and even though there are what we call loss of war, but until the war is concluded, it is too early to begin to look at all the legal ramifications of this war. What is important on both sides is that they want to win the war. And until the war is won, every other thing can wait. For fair is foul and foul is fair in this war. So the sending of the 3,000 reservists for now, we may not necessarily look at it from the point of the loss of war until the war is concluded. But I think Ukraine has defense agreements with the countries sending the soldiers. So if their defense agreements covers the sending of the soldiers, then being a sovereign country, it is free to enter into treaties. And we know by virtue of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, Ukraine is free to, as a sovereign state, to do whatever it likes within its territory, subject to other treaties it might have entered into. So I think it is not out of place to send them based on defense agreement that Ukraine has ordered with other countries. So for now, I think Ukraine is in order, unless it goes outside the treaties, and if Russia is in a position to challenge that. Basically, under international law, Ukraine is still within its bounds to invoke the provisions of its treaties to invite friendly soldiers to support it in this war of aggression from Russia, which emanated since February 2022.
Many years after this, Barrister Eze, we can look back and learn lessons from this Ukraine-Russia war. And amongst those lessons will obviously be how communications technology and how the media affects an army and their decisions in a conflict such as this. Now that the F-16s seems to be the intention of these countries to donate F-16s to Ukraine seems to be gathering some steam, albeit in a slow manner, and countries have decided to help Ukraine in training F-16 fighter pilots, including Romania, some to be stationed there, including in Denmark. And now that Russia says that they see that as an escalation, if F-16s are sent because of their capability to carry nuclear weapons, they'll see this as a threat of a nuclear kind from NATO and from the allies of Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
I think Russia is right, but wrong at the same time. Recall that after the Cold War, the NATO and the West allowed Russia to have a relationship of peace with NATO and the West. But it got to a point that after the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the West condemning that action of Russia, Russia severed its relationship with NATO and the West in terms of all agreements, including the nuclear proliferation. So Russia having disconnected itself from these agreements, including defense agreements, it cannot turn around to begin to criticize the West for supplying or about to supply Ukraine with weapons when it has itself abrogated the agreements it has with the West. So that will amount to doublespeak. I think on the moral note, Ukraine has presented this war as trying to salvage civilization. When extrapolated, that if it is defeated, it means Western civilization has been defeated. Because if you look at the objectives of NATO, the first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, said that the purpose of NATO was to take the Soviet Union out, bring the Americans in, and step down the Germans. So the Russians are still seeing NATO as taking them out, bringing in the Americans, and stepping down on the Germans. So even though that is not the main purpose, but with that statement from the first Secretary General, the Russians don't want Ukraine to have anything to do with NATO. And as they see it as an existential threat. As long as it continues and there is possibility that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, this war of attrition will continue. And we don't know how long it will take. So some of the lessons we take is that history will continue to repeat itself. Technology or no technology, history will continue to repeat itself.
We hope that it repeats itself in the way this time of de-escalation, armistice, treaty, and maybe not exactly in that order. Thank you so much, Barrister Chukwuemeka Eze, who joined us from Enugu in southeast Nigeria. He is a lecturer, former lecturer on diplomatic and consular relations law, Faculty of Law, Nasarawa State University, KEFI. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
After the break, Hungary. Olympic Committee confronted with irreconcilable positions over allowing Russian, Belarusian athletes. Please stay with us.
From the north to the south, east and west, Network Africa brings you news stories from all around the continent, with wide-ranging coverage, insights, and analysis of special issues. We dissect Africa in its beauty and peculiarities. Network Africa tells the African story from the African perspective. Network Africa, weekdays at 4 p.m.
Welcome to the final stretch of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. As the events unfold in both countries and around the world of business weighs in many aspects. Our business correspondent, Ini John Mecca, is with us in the studio to give us that perspective. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Russia is asking Southeast Asian countries to ditch the dollar.
Yeah.
To get around Western sanctions.
Yeah.
Is this an outlandish proposition?
Well, it's not, and it's not new. The countries have been talking about the dominance of the dollar globally, and they've been talking about how to de-dollarize the world. So with the seized assets of Russia, it's just making countries think twice to say, okay, if our reserve is in dollar and the United States and other Western countries can actually seize it and even talk about how to convert it and use it for what they think is right, perhaps it is time to look for an alternative for the dollar. Because obviously with so much demand, that's why the dollar is really that strong. And if the dollar moves one way or the other, it affects the economy of other countries. For a country like Nigeria and other developing countries, debt servicing, which is done in dollar, obviously becomes more expensive once the dollar is stronger. Gold, oil, everything is denominated in the dollar. So Russia has been talking about how to get an alternative and get countries, to look for an alternative or embrace alternative. Even here in Africa, some countries are talking about, here we have PAPS, a system that is supposed to help African countries to trade among themselves without resorting to the dollar, not needing a third currency. There was a report I read some time ago that said that the use of dollar has perhaps dropped to about 76% globally. So it's all countries are trying to get some lessons, from the war. Perhaps we shouldn't be so vulnerable to the United States as having all our reserves and our backup for our economy in the dollar. If the United States decides to do anything to its currency, then the whole world catches a cold.
What will be the option? And then we have to have cold medicine.
Of course.
What will be the option then?
For countries like Russia and China and India, they've been having ruble to the yuan, to the rupee, so they trade in their own currency to themselves.
Are they suggesting those currencies?
They're already doing it for things like oil and all of that. Okay. And Russia's foreign exchange market is already trading the yuan. So, they have started implementing some of this, even though it's at a very low level, because how much certainty can you trust, for instance, the yuan? We saw the yuan when COVID came up, even when COVID had almost left in other countries. When they had a wave, they shut down their economy, and it affected everything, affected oil, because they are the second largest consumers and all of that. So, the stability and certainty of these other currencies also makes it difficult for any country to want to peg its economy or connect its economy to it. Remember, in Africa, West Africa, we've been talking about ECHO, a common currency for West African countries. We've not been able to do it. We've not been able to get it off, because if inflation is at this time 22% in Nigeria, at 40-something% in Ghana, in South Africa perhaps it's like 15. You know what I'm saying? So it's difficult.
It's complex.
Yeah, it is complex. That's what's going on in Europe. So even they have different inflation. It affects the level of economic growth. It affects the response to economic policies. So making the country or the union or the zone work as one country with one currency, or even, who says how much is Naira should go for to the CD in Ghana? Who will determine how much when you don't have a currency that has come to be trusted over time, like the dollar? So it's a long project, but we see the minister in Russia going to Indonesia and some other countries and trying to persuade them to embrace maybe using the ruble or their own currency in the different trades that they could engage, because even the trade between Russia and Indonesia and the Asian countries has dropped more than about 2% or so, because of the sanctions and the use of the dollar.
Finally, in one word, how is Russia moving to save the ruble?
They're intervening, they're going to their reserves and all of that. Remember, we talked about how sometimes the numbers look better than the real thing, you know. So we've seen the ruble has been dropping for some time now. I think last week it hit a 1-year low, you know. So, but they've been going into their reserve. I think so far they have spent about $18 million.
Right.
You understand, to try to boost the ruble. So it's all the intervention we'll be talking about from the Central Bank of Russia.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
More from Ini on Business Morning after the program, so please stay tuned. The International Olympic Committee is confronted with the irreconcilable positions of Russia and Ukraine on the participation of Russian and Belarusian athletes at next year's Olympics. In March, the IOC published a set of recommendations for international sports federations to allow the athletes to return since being banned for Moscow's invasion of Ukraine last year. In an updated version of these recommendations, the IOC says the Russian side wants to ignore the war, while the Ukrainian side insists it totally isolates anyone with Russian or Belarusian passports. And that's where we leave it for today's edition of Russian Invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks to you, our viewers, our guests, and our producers for being a part of it. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a great weekend.